As we would say in the southern part of the United States where I grew up, it's a great getting up moment. And the reason it's that kind of a moment and that kind of a morning is because we have really gathered for a noble purpose. A noble purpose that, of course, is the brainchild of my Spelman sister, Dr. Jacqueline Jones. In her own words, Africa Atlanta must strive to reshape the relationship between Africa, Europe, and the Americas by connecting like-minded innovators and by celebrating African cultures. Now, before I offer some remarks that I sincerely hope might make a small contribution to this conference and this year-long set of activities, I simply have to bring you greetings. I simply must bring you greetings from the Smithsonian Institution, and most specifically, from the top person, the secretary, known so well in this environment, Dr. G. Wayne Clough, former president of Georgia Tech. Of course, I also bring you greetings from my museum, the Smithsonian's National Museum of African Art. Now, were I greeting you inside of the National Museum of African Art, my very first words would be, welcome home. I inevitably use those words when visitors or friends or supporters are in the museum because they're accurate words. After all, we do, as Jackie said, collect, conserve, exhibit, educate about visual arts from Africa, which is to say from the only place on earth from which we have all descended. So I could also greet you by saying, good morning, my fellow Africans. Let me turn now to the noble purpose around which we have gathered. Let me see how in the world we wrestle with what Dr. Royster has charged us to do. And that is in some way to participate in what must be seen as a long, difficult, and yet righteous struggle for Africa and the West to look at each other through different eyes. My, Dean Royster, what a noble but difficult task. Before this audience, there's certainly no need for me to go into the minute details of how relationships between the West, Africa, and the Americas started and continues. But I do think that I must find a way to refer to relationships that are captured by three words: enslavement, colonialism, and imperialism. As you know, the transatlantic slave trade that took place across the Atlantic Ocean from the 16th through the 19th centuries involved some of the most horrific treatment of human beings in the history and her story of the world. In the financial interests of slave owners, African people were forced to labor under almost indescribably horrible conditions. to work as enslaved peoples on coffee, tobacco, cocoa, sugar, and cotton plantations, in gold and silver mines, and in rice fields. I want to offer just one vivid expression of how the brutality of enslavement was intertwined with the rawness of economic greed. It's captured in a practice whereby if a pregnant enslaved woman was to be punished, a hole was dug in the earth so that she could lay with her belly protected by the earth while her back was exposed to receive the overseer's whip. You all know about the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, sometimes called the Scramble for Africa. It took place at the request of Portugal, and German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck called together the major Western powers to end confusion over who controlled which parts of Africa. Before the conference, 80% of Africa was under traditional and local control. After that conference, Africa was divided into 50 irregularly shaped countries that lacked rhyme or reason, but instead reflected the greed of European powers. The colonization of Africa by the West, it was motivated by European desire to exploit Africa's natural and human resources, and the uprooting of African people's spiritual values by Western missionaries led to a situation where many African peoples could say, and say quite truthfully, when the white man came, we had the land, and they had the Bible. Now we have the Bible, and they have the land. By the time the movements for independence swept across the African continent, beginning, of course, in 1957 with Ghana's independence from Britain, many Africans knew that their traditional and cultural practices had been weakened or destroyed. An important point that must be made is this. In order for Western people to subject African people to the brutality of enslavement and the injustices of colonialism and imperialism, they had to create a mythology of their own racial inferiority, superiority, and the inferiority of Africa's people, whether on the continent or in the diaspora. Those were the untruths through which Western people looked at Africans. And how had the people of Africa and the African diaspora looked at the peoples of the West? Surely in a number of ways. Ways that the oppressed, no matter who they are, have throughout history and her story looked at their oppressors with fear, with hatred, with disdain, with dismay, and yes, with envy. So given how the people of Africa and the West have been in each other's lives, looking at each other through unchanged eyes, how in the world and they begin to see each other differently. Now, while I cannot claim to have a definitive answer to this question, I do want to make two basic points. First, if the peoples of Africa and the West are to start out on this complex, difficult journey of learning to see each other through different eyes, they must be convinced that there's an advantage in doing so. When we look at the South African process of reconciliation, we gain insight into how enormously challenging it is for people who have been oppressors and the people who have been oppressed to actually conclude, to really conclude and to feel in the marrow of their bones that life will be better for all if they can work on a different and more just way of seeing, understanding, and relating to each other. It is simply far easier for oppressors to protect the economic and psychological advantages of having power over the oppressed. And it is tempting for the oppressed to imagine and, yes, to desire simply exchanging roles with their oppressors. The second point is this. It is no less difficult, and yet it is ultimately possible, I believe, for human beings to engage in the transformative power of human empathy. The simplest way to say what human empathy is about is to say it is walking in someone else's shoes. Must I be Jewish to understand and feel the horrors of the Holocaust? The answer is, it is possible, and human empathy may be the opening way to accomplish it. I am not a paraplegic, but can I not, through human empathy, come to some understanding of what it is like to be almost totally immobilized? I believe that through human empathy, but always buttressed with serious study and a whole lot of hard work, it is possible for white folks to come to some degree of understanding about the realities of black folks' experiences. Now, as the saying goes, we women folk are from Venus, and the men folk are from Mars. But through serious contemplation, through serious scholarship, and I don't mean simply that we associate with the classroom, but study, through contemplation, through study, through human empathy, I actually believe that the Martian can come to better understand us women folk. As difficult indeed, as impossible as it may sound, I believe that through the transformative power of human empathy, we human beings can come to better understand each other, to see each other through new eyes. Listen to James Baldwin's compelling words. You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world. But then you read, it was books that taught me that the things that tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive or who had ever been alive. turn to ask, is there a role that museums in the West have played in not only perpetuating, but first creating untrue, distorted, harmful, and destructive notions about Africa and the diaspora? The answer is a definitive yes. A simple way that this was done was by the use of words in the text in our museums. Words such as primitive and exotic to describe African people as they were portrayed in ethnographic, historical, and art museums. At museums in Europe and the United States, there's a long history of promoting untrue and distorted notions about Africa and her people by this simple act of exclusion. When a museum describes itself as presenting the fine arts of the world, but there are no artworks, or very few, from Africa, what does that say? Could it be that the ultimate expression of disrespect of the peoples and cultures of Africa by the museums of the West occurred when these museums became sites, places for masterworks of African art that were the spoils of European colonialism and imperialism? Among the well-documented cases of this practice is what is called the British Punitive Exhibition against Benin in 1897. Benin was crushed, and its exquisite artworks were stolen. This disrespect of the Oba, his royal court, and the Edo people of Benin City, Nigeria, is well documented. There is, in fact, an infamous photograph of British soldiers sitting in the royal palace where they were smoking and smiling as if to say, look what we got. Before them on the ground lay treasures of 16th century Benin art. While some of these treasures were privately looted, most were taken back to Britain, where they can be seen today at the British Museum. The looting of Benin was in many ways the first and very dramatic exposure that Europeans had to classic African art. There were also, of course, the very troubled events that took place in other parts of the continent. In particular, we, of course, are, during this conference, very conscious of what happened in the Congo, where at the hands of King Leopold, some of the worst atrocities of colonialism and imperialism took place. And into the Royal Museum for Central Africa were placed some of the Congo people's finest works of art. Today, Belgium and the rest of the nations of the West must bear witness to the injustices of the past and explore the possibility of a different future. The truly remarkable, stunning, stellar exhibition, Congo Across the Waters, that some of us were privileged to see last evening. That exhibition begs us to think about how and why such exquisite works from Congolese culture are now in the Royal Museum for Central Africa, and much to our enlightenment have been shown now to us. The question is begged, and that is if, when, how those expressions of the cultures of the Congo should be returned to where they have come from. At the museum where I have the privilege of working, the National Museum of African Art, we very carefully adhere to the UNESCO Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import and export and transfer of ownership of cultural property. This UNESCO Convention, of course, the first international instrument dedicated to the fight against illicit trafficking of cultural property, is adhered to by almost all museums. It was adopted in Paris at the 16th General Conference of UNESCO on November 14, 1970. It came into force on April 24, 1972. Today, 125 states are parties to this treaty. But the question that looms in front of all of us who are privileged to work in museums, including mine, is this: what about cultural property acquired before the UNESCO Convention came into effect in 1970? There's a third way in which museums in the West have been complicit in perpetuating false and destructive images of Africa and her people. Namely, in museums throughout Europe and the United States, we see few, if any, African and African diasporic museum professionals. The number of people of color from any part of the world who are in museums in the West as directors, curators, conservators, archivists, and other professionals, the numbers are mighty small. The number of African, in the sense of from the African continent directly, women and men in such positions is smaller yet. I am pleased to at least say that in an organization, our organization, Sister Rebecca, the Association of Art Museum Directors, an association that involves art museum directors in the United States, Canada, and Mexico, we are really trying to address this issue. If our museums are to indeed reflect the complex, the extraordinary, the beautiful works of the peoples of the world, must not the peoples of the world be the professionals of those museums? Well, I want to begin now to at least move from here to there, or there. I want to do so by returning to the charge we received from our Sister Dean, Jackie Washington. Namely, that Africa and the West must cease ways to stop looking at each other through unchained eyes. Unchanged. One could also say unchained? No. All right, let me do this correctly. Africa and the West must seek ways to stop looking at each other through unchanged eyes and still see the relationship as being marred by the transatlantic slave trade. Well, we all know this is a truly complex and incredibly difficult task. But let us acknowledge that Africa Atlanta, and hopefully this particular conference of today, will present us with a definitive opportunity to take at least some steps on that very long journey.